All right. Well, I want to make sure we have enough time for this fantastic conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Dr. Erica Trappel, and on behalf of the Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods, I'd like to welcome you to our January research seminar. All right, technology. All right. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you've not connected with us before, we'd love for you to connect with us now. You can learn more about the work that we do at the Prevention Research Center at prchn.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and then you can catch any of our seminars from the past, as well as this one soon, on our YouTube page at Crew PRCHN. We always like to highlight what's coming next, and so we're excited to share that our next seminar will be held on Wednesday, February 14th. Yes, this is Valentine's Day, but we know you want to celebrate with us. So please feel free to register now. Our speaker will be our good friend, Dr. Liz Klein, who is the professor and chair of the Division of Health Behavior and Health Promotion at Ohio State University. And she'll be speaking on the impact of flavored cigarillo labels on product packages, visual attention, and risk perceptions among youth and young adult cigarillo users and non-users. Since we have maintained a virtual seminar for the last several years, we attempt to create some camaraderie by asking everyone to just introduce themselves in the chat so that everybody knows who is here with us today. You might find someone new to connect with after or during this presentation, and we'd just like to know who's here with us today. We will take questions after Dr. Smith's presentation. You're welcome to raise your hand and we'll call you off mute to come and ask in person, or you can always type your questions in the chat box. Okay, and now I am very excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Danielle Smith. Dr. Smith and I met quite a few years ago at an annual meeting of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, and she's always had an interest in cannabis. And I said, you know, I think at some point our crowds are going to just keep passing and we're going to find ways to work together. And so this is just another step in that process of our intersection of our work over the last several years. So I'm excited to share what I know about Dr. Smith's work with all of you today. So let me give you a little bit about Dr. Smith's background. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center and is formally trained in behavioral epidemiology and public health, receiving her PhD in community health and health behavior from the University at Buffalo School of Public Health and Health Professions in 2021. She also has experience working in select areas of health psychology and pharmacology and toxicology. She's published nearly 50 papers on topics related to nicotine and cannabis use, and her works appeared in Lancet Respiratory Medicine, JAMA Network Open, Nicotine and Tobacco Research, all the most notorious journals for this kind of work. She is also, aside from all the published work, just a really deep source of knowledge about what's happening with the cannabis industry and how that really translates into how things are happening across the country and in her own state with legalization and other policy-related matters. So to have sort of that deep knowledge of the field as well as the science, I think makes her just such a unique expert in this space, and a real opportunity for all of us to hear from her today. So without further ado, I am going to take off my share if I can figure out how to do that. Here we go. And welcome Dr. Danielle Smith to go ahead and share her screen and get us started.
Thank you, Erica, for that very kind introduction. Let me just get oriented here. All right, folks good on the slides? You can see everything. All right, awesome, great, thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation to speak today. As Dr. Trappel mentioned, I'll be sharing some information on the co-use of nicotine and cannabis, including what we know, why it's important, and then talk a little bit more toward the end of the talk about some directions for future research. In customary fashion, here are my disclosures. My work is federally and institutionally funded. I don't have any financial or other conflicts to declare. So even though I'm talking about nicotine and cannabis co-use today, I usually like to begin these talks by orienting folks with a short overview as to why this issue is important in the broader context of what's going on. And what's going on is that we're seeing continued liberalization of cannabis throughout the United States, which is bringing many important issues such as co-use to light. So, Dr. Trappel and I were just talking before the call. Ohio, was the most recent state to join the increasing number of states that have legalized non-medical use of cannabis. So about half the nation is covered now under these legal non-medical cannabis policies, while about 3/4 of the nation is covered by laws permitting the use of cannabis for medical applications only. So this continued emergence of state laws, this is bringing up a lot of important empirical questions regarding what, if any, effect legalization will have on the use and consequences of cannabis at the population level. And this includes whether the legalization and use of cannabis will exert an impact on use and consequences of other substances of abuse, particularly, nicotine and alcohol. With cannabis, it's also important to really define what you're talking about. We talk about cannabis, but in reality, cannabis can mean many different things. Cannabis at its most basic level is a plant with a very complex chemistry, but we're not always talking about an intoxicating substance. So, we have multiple species of the cannabis plant. Cannabis, we're referring to the plant genus, and there's two main classifications we have here, which are drug and non-drug cannabis. The plants look the same, but they really differ based on the compounds that are contained within the plant. And the biggest difference is with compounds called phytocannabinoids or plant cannabinoids. The two most prevalent and well-researched of these, which you may or may not have heard of, are delta-9 THC, called THC for short, and CBD. So with delta-9 THC, this cannabinoid is infamous for its intoxicating effects. So this is what produces the high that consumers experience when they consume cannabis. And this tends to be present in higher concentrations in drug cannabis compared to hemp. THC also has a number of therapeutic properties. It acts as an anti-inflammatory agent, neuroprotective agent, has anti-nausea, pain-relieving properties, among others. In higher doses, it can also produce negative acute effects such as anxiety and paranoia for consumers. And products with particularly high levels of THC concentrations are also typically linked to greater abuse of cannabis and risk for developing cannabis use disorder. So I say all of this because for the purpose of this talk, the majority of studies that have looked at nicotine cannabis co-use have really focused on the use of high THC containing variants. So for today, when I'm discussing cannabis in the context of co-use, this is typically what I'm going to be referring to unless I say otherwise. So in my research program, I approach the study of cannabis by thinking about what implications cannabis use has on cancer-related outcomes and public health. From my view, the issue isn't whether cannabis use and legalization is a good thing or a bad thing. I think that's an oversimplification. The key issue really becomes under what conditions can cannabis provide benefits, and under what conditions does it create risks or harms to patients and the public at large. So most studies that I conduct focus on the prevention and treatment domains of what we refer to as the cancer care continuum, which is depicted in this orange graphic here on the slide. And here, nicotine cannabis co-use really falls under this issue of cancer prevention. And I'm going to discuss throughout the talk a little bit why that's the case. Because of this framing, I also tend to examine what co-use means for nicotine and tobacco related outcomes rather than what co-use means for cannabis related outcomes, although I will just note at this point that both are important. So all of that to go into, the crux of the talk. We're talking about nicotine cannabis co-use, but what is it? So when we're talking about the co-use of substances, really, we're talking about the use of two or more substances at the same time, so co-occurring use. The current terminology in co-use it's a bit of a mixed bag. But here on the slide, I have outlined the taxonomy that I and many of my colleagues who study this area use. Behaviorally, we've got certain subsets of co-use that we focus on, which become important to consider due to the outcomes that they lead to. Often you'll see studies that discuss co-use as concurrent use, which is just simply referring to the dual use of both nicotine and cannabis products within a given time frame. So we could be talking about co-use that occurs within the past year, within the past month, et cetera, but it's not giving any real specification to exactly how the substances are used together. This is in contrast to something that we talk about in terms of behaviors as simultaneous use. So Simultaneous use means that we're talking about the use of both substances within the same use episode. So with nicotine and cannabis co-use, this can occur in a number of different ways. I'm particularly interested in a behavior known as sequential co-use, which refers to a behavior where a consumer will use a nicotine product like cigarettes or nicotine vaping products immediately following cannabis. So in lay terminology, consumers refer to this as chasing cannabis with nicotine. The other main form of simultaneous use is known as co-administration, which involves using nicotine and cannabis combined together in the same delivery mechanism for use at the same time. So here on the slide, I've depicted the most common method of co-administration, which is blunt use. So this usually involves taking a tobacco cigar, replacing some or all of the contents with cannabis, and then the consumer would proceed to smoke the product. That said, there are more novel forms of co-administration that are occurring mostly through consumer-driven do-it-yourself approaches at this time, such as mixing nicotine and cannabinoid e-liquids together in vaping products. So why is co-use important to study in the context of cancer prevention and public health? So the first key thing I think is important in this area is the current data show that most cannabis consumers are consumers of nicotine and tobacco products. So we really have a pretty substantial overlap in the populations. So we can look at this issue of population overlap in a few different ways. If you're looking over the life course, the use of cannabis has been estimated to be as high as 90% among those who have ever smoked tobacco. But studying in the addiction realm, we're usually concerned with more refined definitions of what constitutes use of a product, such as current or frequent use, since these are the patterns of use that tend to lead to most of the adverse consequences associated with substance use. So the estimates that I have on the slide here are based on results from several studies across the literature. But here we can see that the level of overlap for cannabis consumers is more substantial, with about 50 to 75% of cannabis consumers reporting current use of some type of nicotine product, whether this is cigarettes, vaping products, cigars, among others. If you were to look at this the other way, you can see that the use of cannabis among nicotine consumers, you can see that this is a smaller but still substantial proportion of nicotine consumers who are using cannabis. And those estimates range from about 25 to 30% of nicotine consumers that use cannabis products. So this brings us to the issue of the prevalence of co-use in the past. So this is looking at past 30-day co-use, which I've depicted here on the slide for adults and youth separately. So the estimates for adults are from the nationally representative population assessment of tobacco and health, or PATH study, and the dates covered here are from 2013 to 2019. The youth estimates are from an earlier paper. It's a little bit dated, that had used data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, covering the period from 2005 to 2014. So the key things from these data is that we can see that the use of nicotine and tobacco products among adults and youth, so this is going to be the dark blue line on the graphic for adults and the moderate gray line for youth. So the prevalence of this has declined over time, right? We can also see that cannabis-only use, which is depicted by the light blue line for adults and the light gray line for youth, has increased over time. These rates are commensurate with what's been published in other surveillance projects. The co-use of nicotine and cannabis, which is depicted by the green line for adults and the black line for youth, this is more prevalent than exclusive use of cannabis over time. And we've observed this increase among adults that has occurred from 2013 to 2019, and a relatively flat trend for youth for the periods under study using the NIST data. So for most recent estimates, we're really looking at about 8.1% of adults who report co-use of nicotine and cannabis in the past 30 days, which is almost double what we see for the estimate of exclusive use of cannabis. And for youth, the most recent co-use estimate is 5.8%, which is also about twice that of the prevalence of exclusive cannabis use in 2014. So again, you can look at the issue of co-use trends through these kind of lenses of different subsets of consumers. So if we're looking at this, by the subset of the population that uses each substance, we can also see, some interesting information come to light here. We can see that over time, if we restrict the data to cannabis consumers only, which is the dark blue line at the top, there's higher prevalence of nicotine use among this group, but the nicotine product use is declining over time among cannabis consumers. If we look at this the other way, looking at nicotine consumers over time, which is the light blue line, overall prevalence of cannabis use in this group is lower, but it's actually been increasing over time. So, the key takeaway here is that while the nature of co-use for each population subset differs, the increase in co-use that we're seeing at the population level is really being driven by nicotine consumers adopting cannabis rather than cannabis consumers adopting the use of nicotine. In this area, it's also important to consider that we live in a very complex product landscape for nicotine and for cannabis products. So it becomes important to consider the products involved, which I'll get into a little bit more detail later on. For now, some of the data from PATH suggests that among adults, some of the data from adults from PATH, suggests that the trends in co-use differ according to the type of nicotine product that we're looking at. So on this slide here, I've depicted the findings for tobacco cigarettes on the left and for e-cigarettes on the right. Just as two example products. We're fleshing this out in a little bit more detail with a more comprehensive list of products in a paper that we're working on. But what we can see here is that among people who smoke cigarettes, the prevalence of cannabis-only use and nicotine cannabis co-use have been roughly similar over time. But co-use experienced a little bit of a decline from 2016 to 2019, and this is unclear right now. This is a blip in the data or indicative of an emerging decline among those who use cigarettes. If we're looking by comparison, looking at the co-use of e-cigarettes and cannabis, that actually the prevalence is actually lower than both exclusive cannabis use and exclusive use of e-cigarettes, but has been increasing over time. And in fact, if we're looking at the trend line for co-use from 2013 to 2019, that's actually representative of a 128% increase over time. So, while the absolute prevalence of e-cigarette and cannabis co-use is low, this does seem to indicate that e-cigarette cannabis co-use is becoming a much more common form of co-use among the adult general population. I also mentioned that there are some concerns about whether state level cannabis policies have an effect on prevalence and trends in co-use. Again, these are data from the PATH study looking at adults who use cannabis only in panel A, cigarettes only in panel B, and who have co-used cigarettes and cannabis in the past 30 days in panel C. Key takeaway with this slide is that it appears that there are secular trends that are primarily driving things, rates of use at the population level. And, we can see here that irrespective of whether folks are living in states where cannabis is fully illegal, whether it's medically legal or whether it's recreationally and medically legal, cannabis use is going up across the board over time. We can also see that cigarette use, commensurate with national level data, is going down across the board, irrespective of the cannabis policy environment, and that co-use is going up across the board. So that said, it's important to kind of follow up these high-level trend assessments with longitudinal examinations of what's going on with individual behavior change over time as a function of policy, which is an area that our group is focusing on a little bit more now. There's also a cultural context to consider with nicotine and cannabis co-use. So these data are from another project that I'm involved in, which is the International Tobacco Control Study. These are some data from our 4-country smoking and vaping survey, which is conducted in the United States, Canada, England, and Australia. And like the PATH study, the ITC project consists of a longitudinal cohort where we're following, these recruited samples of nicotine consumers, including people who smoke cigarettes, people who vape nicotine, and then also people who have quit over time. So what I have here on the slide are cross-sectional data from the 2022 wave of the survey. And on the graphic, you can see that there are exclusive consumers of cigarettes or e-cigarettes, noted by the orange bars, while we have the co-consumers of nicotine and cannabis noted by the blue bars. So really what we can see here is that across countries, you can see that the fraction of nicotine consumers who also consume cannabis, it's higher in North America. It's higher in Canada and the United States compared to England and Australia. And this is important because, we have more liberal cannabis policies in Canada and the United States. Canada has federally legal cannabis, while the US has more of a patchwork approach, but generally erring more toward the liberal side of cannabis policy, whereas England has a very restrictive medical only policy, and Australia is at this point mostly a medical cannabis policy country, although there is some variation based on the states within Australia. So really these data, kind of follow what we see within the US, which is that areas with recreationally legal cannabis tend to have higher overall prevalence of cannabis use. Talked a little bit before about, not just talking about co-use in terms of time frame, but also talking about this issue of co-use practices. So in the ITC project, we also asked a number of questions about how people were co-consuming their cannabis and nicotine, including several items asking about, these sequential use behaviors and co-administration. So when we broke down the types of behaviors that co-consumers were engaging in, again, we saw some really interesting differences according to country and cultural context. So what I have here on the slide, these data are restricted to folks who reported smoking cigarettes or consuming e-cigarettes at the time of the survey. And the yellow parts of the bar indicates the share of co-consumers who did not report any sequential use or co-administration. So they were just reporting use of both products within the past year in this case. The blue indicates those who reported only sequential use. Red indicates those who reported only co-administered use, and orange indicates those who reported engaging in both sequential use and co-administration. So really what we can see here is that, the exact type of co-use behaviors, they matter and they differ according to cultural context. In North America, we can actually see that sequencing practices, so the sequential co-use where people chase their cannabis with nicotine it's really prevalent, and it constitutes one of the more common forms of co-use compared to other areas. England and Australia, particularly England, we can see that co-administration, which is where tobacco and cannabis are combined together in spliffs customarily in England and Australia. That's really the predominant form of co-use in other countries. So, again, this aligns with other data suggesting that co-administration is the customary method of cannabis consumption abroad. But again, the key takeaway for this slide is really understanding that co-use doesn't mean one thing, it means many different behaviors, and that it tends to vary across different contexts. The issue of co-use in vulnerable populations, also increasingly important, and particularly how it may contribute to health outcomes in, disparate populations in particular. So these are some data looking at tobacco cannabis co-use in a cohort of approximately 1,200 Black and Hispanic adolescent and young adult females who attend a large adolescent medical center in New York City. So this is some work I'm doing with my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Nicholas Schlecht here at Roswell Park. So in this project, we looked at whether and how trends in co-use contributed to substance use risk behaviors later in life. I'll note that the prevalence of past 30-day cannabis use in this cohort, one thing that was notable about these data is that it was just exceptionally high compared to the general population. We had about 59% of this cohort reporting past month use of cannabis in 2020. So, again, underscoring the importance of focusing in on vulnerable population subsets when studying this topic. On the graphic here, we can see that the use of blunts, depicted as the pink line, increased over the 7-year study period from 2014 to 2020, while the use of combustible tobacco products, which is depicted by the green line, declined over the same time period. However, you'll recall that blunt use most commonly involves direct combination of tobacco and cannabis in the same product. So if you think about blunts as a form of tobacco use and include that in product estimates for tobacco, you can actually see that the increase in blunt use over time is leading to this flattening of tobacco use rates in this population, which is depicted by the blue line. So, important to consider that blunt use may actually be sustaining overall rates of tobacco use. We also saw in this project that even infrequent use of blunts was linked to about twice the odds of developing symptoms indicative of a substance use disorder later in life after controlling for other factors. So who tends to be a co-consumer? Talking a little, these are some of the typical characteristics that we see of co-consumers based on which the literature currently shows. There is some variability in characteristics of co-consumers by particular types of products used. We're working on publishing some of these data now, but we do tend to see co-consumers are more often male, particularly with co-administered co-use. This tends to be most common in African-American communities. We tend to see these behaviors more commonly expressed in those who are younger in age, also in those who tend to experience more disadvantages in terms of level of household income, level of employment, folks that experience medical comorbidities and other substance use comorbidities. Co-use tends to be very common there. We also see that co-consumption of nicotine and cannabis is fairly common in those who experience mental health problems, very common among those with bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, personality disorders. So turning to the next reason why co-use is important to study, it seems that there are several mechanisms that underlie this kind of unique relationship between the two substances that create circumstances that lead to co-use. Some of these are more general in nature, and some of these are more unique to these two substances in particular. Number of theories out there, these are some of the common theories that have been suggested as a lens for kind of looking at the study of co-use. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, gateway theory. It's very commonly discussed. It's where someone, basically substance use follows a sequence where individuals move from softer to harder substances. We also have the reverse gateway theory, which is exactly what it sounds like. People precede softer drug use with harder drug use. The issue with gateway theory is that, the sequencing isn't always consistent. We also see that in many cases, individuals who use a substance don't go on to become regular consumers of a substance. So there are a number of issues with kind of this gateway theory lens of co-use. By contrast, we also have the common liability model that gets applied to co-use pretty frequently. And basically with this, we're focusing more on the characteristics of consumers. So in common liability models, the behavior tends to be a symptom of underlying vulnerability or predispositions to engaging in risk behaviors such as co-use. These can include characteristics such as sensation-seeking behaviors, mental health issues, some of the things that, I talked a little bit on that last slide about characteristics of co-consumers. So in terms of some of the underlying mechanisms and facilitators that have been described with co-use, if you ask a scientist why people co-use nicotine and cannabis, here's some of what they'll tell you. We do know that the endocannabinoid system, which is the underlying system that cannabis acts upon, is also involved in addiction and addictive behavior. This includes nicotine addiction. Particularly the endocannabinoid system is involved in many of the rewarding aspects of substance use. And there are specific interactions that occur with the co-use of nicotine and cannabis. We also know that people who tend to be prone to substance use problems in general also tend to co-use nicotine and cannabis. And this group exhibits certain traits predictive of greater substance use in general. So again, this aligns with many of the overarching theories in this area. Something else that's important to consider specific to these two substances is that data from several studies seem to indicate that co-use of nicotine and cannabis enhances subjective effects of cannabis while offsetting many of the negative acute effects, which plays a role in facilitating drug reward and reinforcement. We also know that nicotine and cannabis share inhalation as their most common route of administration and also share many common modes of delivery, including smoking and vaping. So here on the slide, I've got Elf Bar, a very popular vaping product depicted, and Elf Bar is perhaps most notorious for being used to administer nicotine vaping products. However, Elf Bar variants that deliver THC have been marketed and sold. Interesting to note that the products look identical, and the issue of brand recognition may actually facilitate product appeal to draw people into using one or the other substance. We also see that co-use is thought to be facilitated by aspects of advertisement and endorsement in pop culture, including direct and indirect promotion of co-use behaviors. So, here on the slide, I've got the example of Snoop Dogg, a very famous cannabis consumer who's pictured consuming a blunt, again, a co-administered form of use. And then we also see that there's some overlap between the tobacco and cannabis industries. A really good example of this is Altria, right? Altria is the parent company of Philip Morris. They make Marlboro cigarettes. A few years ago, they actually bought a 40% stake in Kronos Group, which is a cannabis company. So this is kind of talking about, or at least getting at the idea that the tobacco industry is looking to diversify into that extension into the cannabis industry. We also know that this is the case with other popular manufacturers. British American Tobacco, they're a maker of premium brand cigarettes like Pall Malls and Newport. They also manufacture CBD vaping products and have shown increasing interest in developing their cannabis program. So becoming a more important, facilitator of co-use that requires monitoring over time. So just to highlight a few key examples of data supporting these facilitators from the literature. Again, these are some data from the ITC project that looked at how nicotine consumers are using their cannabis, which are listed at the bottom of the slide. So we have the preference for each of these modes of cannabis delivery broken out among exclusive cigarette smokers on the left, dual users of cigarettes and e-cigarettes in the middle, and exclusive e-cigarette users on the right. So really across the board, you can see that smoking cannabis without tobacco, which is the bar furthest to the left of each group in blue, was the most prevalent preferred form of cannabis use, no matter what types of nicotine products people were consuming. You can also see that smoking cannabis with tobacco was the second highest preferred form of cannabis use among the groups that reported use of tobacco cigarettes. So this would be the exclusive cigarette smokers and the dual users. They tended to endorse smoking cannabis with their tobacco more so than the folks that were using e-cigarettes. Looking at this another way, if you're looking at vaping cannabis liquids or oils, which is denoted by the gray bars on the slide here, we can see that while overall prevalence is much lower compared to other methods of use, prevalence for this mode of cannabis delivery was higher among the dual users and exclusive e-cigarette users compared to exclusive cigarette smokers. And we actually saw a very similar pattern observed from vaping cannabis flower through a dryer vaporizer, which is noted in the yellow on the slide here. So there are subtleties here. These are subtle patterns, but potentially important ones, especially given the rise in what we're seeing and rising popularity in vaping product use. So bottom line, route of administration does seem to matter. Everyone seems to like smoking cannabis and joints, but there's this tendency for the similar modes of delivery to cluster together. People who like to smoke tobacco tend to combine their tobacco and cannabis. People who like to vape their nicotine tend to vape their cannabis. Especially with sequential use and co-administration, we see study after study suggesting that co-use enhances the subjective effects of cannabis, like I mentioned before. There's also a school of thought suggesting that nicotine use reduces negative effects of cannabis use by improving memory, alertness while under the influence. This is likely due to a combination of drug pharmacology and interactions, as well as psychological elements involved in substance use behavior, such as consumer perceptions, expectancy effects, and learning. So here on the slide, just as an example, are some data from a paper we published a few years ago that looked at consumers who vaped nicotine and cannabis and the reasons that they had vaped both substances. So, we asked a number of questions about their reasons for using both substances, and these were grouped into 4 different categories. So top line here is referring to a construct as instrumentality. Instrumentality as this construct is really the reason for co-use that relates to the idea that co-use makes people feel higher. So what we had found in this study was that co-consumers who had higher ratings for instrumentality related reasons for co-use also tended to have higher overall monthly nicotine use. And they actually had threefold higher odds of engaging in sequential use behavior. So what those data are suggesting is that the belief that co-use heightens the effects of cannabis may also translate to actual heightening of product consumption. Just quickly going through this example of some recent pharmacology data from my colleagues at UCSF. They had conducted a crossover study with a small number of participants who smoked tobacco and smoked cannabis. They had participated in sessions where they had used actually a PAX, loose leaf vaporizer, to vape cannabis only, vape tobacco only, and then vape a combination of both tobacco and cannabis in the vaporizer. Basically, what the researchers looked at is a number of pharmacological endpoints you can see here on the slide, looking at peak concentrations during use, which is Cmax, overall exposure to the key pharmacological substances, nicotine and THC, and measures of subjective drug effects, which is at the bottom of the table using the drug effects questionnaire, DEQ. What we can see here, takeaway, is that there's a pattern in the data. This combination of THC and nicotine, which is in the last column on the table, we saw that there was a higher peak THC and nicotine concentrations relative to the use of either substance alone, higher overall THC and nicotine exposure. And we also saw that participants liked using the drug more than what they were using tobacco or cannabis alone. So again, this is for co-administration. It's a little bit less clear what's going on with when people are using the products in sequence, probably because it's more complicated to think through and measure, but this is just to depict some of the pharmacological phenomena that occur when we're talking about co-use. So moving on, co-use, again, important to understand because the existing data also suggests that co-use of nicotine and cannabis tends to lead to more adverse consequences compared to the use of either substance alone. So I will note by stating that the vast majority of research on co-use and its consequences has been conducted looking at cigarette smoking and cannabis smoking. What the literature has shown is that compared with exclusive use of either nicotine or cannabis, co-use is associated with many more poor outcomes. This includes increased use heaviness and increased risk of dependence for both substances. The figure here is from a 2015 review that outlines how the progression of co-use contributes to these ends to reinforce continued use. The evidence is more mixed when it comes to the effect that co-use has on cessation, and this is mostly mixed based on study design. As of now, it seems more clear that co-use impedes cannabis cessation, while findings have been more mixed regarding the impact that cannabis use has on tobacco cessation. Although we are seeing more studies coming out that push the weight of the evidence more toward that cannabis use is likely diminishing success in quitting nicotine. This may be due to withdrawal associated with both substances once use is stopped. Cannabis and nicotine have several overlapping withdrawal symptoms, and previous work has shown that compared to quitting tobacco or cannabis alone, those who co-use both drugs experience more severe withdrawal, particularly peaking around day 4 of a quit attempt, which may contribute to greater relapse for one or both substances. Finally, we also know that co-use of smoked products in particular can lead to additive exposure to smoke-related toxicants and carcinogens, although the long-term impact that these have on health and whether this contributes to a greater disease burden, remains an important area to monitor and address in future research. So again, I'll just highlight a couple of the consequences as they relate to some of the work that our group has done. So again, these are data from the ITC project where we looked at what might be going on with specific co-use practices and their ties to select indicators of nicotine dependence. So on this slide, we've restricted these analyses to daily cigarette smokers who also co-use cannabis. So in the top portion of the slide, looking at the table, we looked at the number of cigarettes smoked per day, time to first cigarette, and heaviness of smoking index broken out by each of these endorsed co-use practices. Table values, what we're looking at here are adjusted means controlling for the effective country. And short story here is that we saw that cigarettes smoked per day was significantly higher in the groups that reported sequential use of cigarettes and cannabis which are groups B and D noted by the superscript letters in the table, compared to co-consumers who only co-administered tobacco or cannabis or who reported doing neither. We saw less going on in terms of differences in time to first cigarette and heaviness of smoking index. But again, we did see significant differences flagging for those who reported sequential use, who generally had shorter time to first cigarette and higher HSI compared to the other groups. Moving to the bottom of the slide, the data in these figures are restricted to daily smokers who reported chasing their nicotine and cannabis. But we'll also, while these data are for smokers, we also have similar questions for nicotine vapors we're working with right now. But you can see in panel A, most daily smokers who chased cannabis with cigarettes reported greater enjoyment compared to using cannabis alone. While in panel B, you can see that when we asked smokers about their cravings to smoke a cigarette when they used cannabis, just under half of daily smokers who reported sequential use said that cannabis had no impact on their craving to smoke cigarettes, while around 1/3 reported that cannabis made their cigarette cravings less intense, and around 20% noting that it made no difference in their cravings for cigarettes. So again, some additional data from work led by my colleague Pete Dreisen from the ITC project. So in this study, we looked at how changes in cannabis smoking practices prospectively contributed to cigarette cessation endpoints. This was over a 2-year period. We operationalized cannabis use practices as reducing or stopping cannabis use over time, having no change in cannabis use over time, or increasing or initiating cannabis use over time. And what we have found in this project is that cannabis use practices had no association with whether people who smoke cigarettes made attempts to quit smoking over time. But among those cigarette smokers who increased their cannabis use or initiated use over time, we saw significantly lower odds of quitting cigarettes in either the short or long term at follow-up. So again, this paper really points to the importance of considering the impact of specific types of behaviors involved in co-use rather than just these kind of blanket assessments of co-use definitions. So really considering the nuance and studying that more intensely and why it matters. Our team's also done some work looking at toxicant exposure among those who co-use nicotine and cannabis. We know that tobacco and cannabis smoke contain many of the same toxicants, but also differ in generated yields of several toxicants and carcinogens, which might be important to consider in longer term assessments outlining the health effects of co-use. So in the figure here, you can see, again, these are data from the PATH study that we had published several years ago. These were biomarker data from wave 1 of the project, which was conducted in 2013 to 2014. And here what we did is we compared biomarker concentrations for 15 smoke-related toxicants between consumers of a single tobacco product versus those who consumed tobacco and also used cannabis within the past month. So across many different biomarkers and tobacco products, we essentially found that co-consumers had significantly higher levels of smoke-related toxicants in their urine compared to people who only consumed tobacco. But we also saw that there were no statistically significant differences in nicotine and tobacco-specific biomarkers between groups. So what we took this to mean is that when people were adding on cannabis on top of their nicotine consumption, they were actually getting additive exposure to smoke-related toxicants and carcinogens that was attributable to their tobacco smoking. So lastly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the gaps in knowledge that remain in this area of research. This is not a comprehensive assessment, but it is some of the more important gaps that our group is continuing to work on in areas that are ripe for expansion in the literature. So I'll just talk a little bit about these quickly. So talking about novel products in health, I mentioned this before, but most of the work on co-use has really centered around consumers who smoke both products. This is obviously very important. It will continue to be important, particularly as we continue to study what's going on with cannabis use at the population level. But the reality is that the product landscape has become much more complicated for both substances. We have vaping products for nicotine and cannabis. We have oral forms of use, many different types of products. So it's not really clear what these different product combinations, what these different behaviors mean in terms of co-use outcomes. and what that really means for, health, really consumer health. We also see a lot more in terms of diversity of product formulation. We've got these hemp isomer products that contain cannabinoids like delta-9 or delta-8 THC. But we don't know what, if any, of these effects may have on co-use behaviors, or whether they present differential levels of risk in terms of co-use and related endpoints. So, overall, we really need to improve understanding of whether certain types of co-use may be more or less problematic, kind of considering this effect of different combinations of products or different formulations of nicotine and cannabis involved. We also need to improve our understanding of the role of medical cannabis and whether it differentially contributes to co-use behaviors and outcomes, specifically in populations that predominantly consume cannabis for therapeutic purposes. So here on the slide, I have depicted a figure from, an upcoming paper. I'm hoping to see it published soon, co-led by Aaron McClure at MUSC and myself, where we had compared rates of cannabis use prior to and following cancer diagnosis among patients with cancer based on their cigarette smoking status. And overall, what we saw were patterns that were very similar to what's been observed in the general population, with patients who reported current cigarette smoking reporting significantly higher rates of cannabis use across all stages of cancer diagnosis and treatment. This was consistent across both study sites, which had both variable legality of cannabis at the time of the study. New York State, we have legal recreational cannabis and medical use here, whereas in South Carolina, they're actually one of the very few states at this point where cannabis is completely illegal. So a lot more work is needed to disentangle contributing effects of specific products and what these effects may be as it relates to treatment and other key health endpoints, both for patients with cancer and among other populations who use medical cannabis. A lot of work needs to be done on the effects of co-use and what it means for the brain and the body, looking at both psychological and physical health endpoints. A lot of the work on co-use is predominantly focused on psychological or behavioral endpoints related to addiction and treatment. These are very clearly important, again, will remain important, but there's a lot less that's known about the effects of co-use on longer-term health endpoints, especially considering novel product use. This will be a literature base that takes quite a bit of time to develop. It reminds me a lot, actually, of the early days of e-cigarette research. We've got many types of product use, and appropriate epidemiologic measurements for assessing use just haven't been around very long. Even more formative work involving basic biology and pharmacology of co-use has a long way to go, just understanding how different types of products and co-use practices work in the body. There's not a lot out there on pharmacology of co-use, but there are a few studies, such as the one I presented earlier, that mostly focus on co-administered use. One thing we're interested in here at Roswell, we're going to be looking at a project that involves the pharmacology of sequential use. So looking at what happens to the pharmacology of THC, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics when THC use is immediately followed by the use of vaped nicotine. This is part of a new R01 that I co-lead with Michelle Ganovich here at Roswell Park. So that work, there's a lot involved with doing controlled laboratory studies of cannabis products. We have our Schedule I research infrastructure and development to perform that work, but we also, as part of that grant, are using some more innovative and novel methods to pursue looking at what cannabis vaping and cannabis co-use is doing to the body. So on the slide here, I've depicted our Roswell Park BioBus, which we're also using to examine drug effects based on products used within the legal state market. Also, a few studies in the pipeline that are looking at behavioral economic relationships between nicotine and cannabis products, including the degree to which nicotine and cannabis products may serve as complementary or substitutional products. The existing work in this area has been a mixed bag, and really just more is needed overall to consider novel product involvement and characteristics of particular subsets of co-consumers. So this on the slide here, I have a picture of our developing experimental cannabis marketplace, which is something I'm working on in collaboration with Dr. Amanda Quisenberry here at Roswell Park. The development of these types of tools can really be used to help address these types of behavioral economic questions, both based on the current state of affairs and in response to potential changes in consumer behaviors or in response to potential policy changes. Also more work needed on the effects of policy change on co-use. This is it's a very challenging area to study due to heterogeneity and the time periods under observation, populations under study that fall under different types of policies, jurisdictions, and definitions of policy in general. So a lot more thoughtful work needs to go into policy related assessments. But this is some work that we're doing right now, again, using the PATH data, figure on the screen here. Comes from some work I'm doing again with Pete Dreisen at the University of Waterloo and Dr. Karen Kaza here at Roswell Park. So here we're conducting an assessment of changes in cannabis use and cigarette smoking behaviors among adults who smoke cigarettes based on implementation of legal recreational cannabis over time. And really what we're seeing in this project is that in about a 1 year period following legalization, adults who smoke cigarettes that live in areas that have implemented recreational cannabis did not differ on their use of cannabis, on their daily smoking, on their levels of nicotine dependence or attempts to quit, compared to adults who smoked that lived in areas that did not legalize cannabis. So, that's important. We're getting this initial early signal that there's really no difference as a function of policy change, but I will say that these types of studies need to also consider effects of legalization on population subsets and duration of legalization. And other different types of state level tobacco and cannabis policies to shed more light on this issue. I know we're nearing time, so I just want to lastly touch on, the issue of treatment. There's more work that's needed to understand how to best treat co-consumers who want to quit one or both substances. It's currently not very clear what the best strategies are, and this is an area ripe for work on intervention development, particularly for those that are kind of meeting the consumers where they're at. Also more work needs to be done to consider which endpoints are most appropriate. We know from the existing work that's been done, many cannabis consumers don't want to quit their use entirely. So the question about an abstinence only model becomes an important one to consider. Are we talking about abstinence? Are we talking about reduction? Which endpoints are important? Which endpoints are realistic? In this area, we also need to consider types of products involved in co-use. CBD, I've got a figure here from an earlier paper. CBD's been shown actually when used on its own to inhibit desire to smoke cigarettes and has actually reduced cigarette consumption in the short term. So considering whether the absence of cannabis or cannabinoids has to be part of the solution or whether it can be a useful agent to facilitate cessation remains an important area of study. So I know that was a lot to digest, but basically the things that I think are important to stress here, there's a significant relationship between nicotine and cannabis. And when we're talking about co-use, it's important to consider that co-use isn't just a blanket term. Not all co-use is the same. We have different forms of co-use and they have different implications associated with each of these different subsets of co-use behaviors. Important to note, especially in the context of legalization, that co-use is it's prevalent, right? This is something that we need to think about when we're studying nicotine and cannabis use respectively, is that oftentimes we're talking about a similar population of consumers. And there's lots of reasons underlying this, some of which I've discussed. So it's important to talk about because we know that there are poorer outcomes associated with co-use. And in order to, kind of advance knowledge and research on this topic, we really need to, come together and collaborate and think about ways for measuring and studying the use of both substances to kind of promote better science and give us better information to go off of. So with that, I'll wrap up. I think we've got a couple minutes here for questions. Just want to acknowledge my collaborators, across various projects, and happy to take any questions you have at this point.
Thanks, Danielle. That was fantastic. I am full of questions, but always love to let our audience have first go. So if there's anyone who would like to ask a question, feel free to use the chat or raise your hand, and you can come off of mute and we can engage with Dr. Smith about her work.
Sorry, I don't know how do you raise your hand?
I think it's down in the reactions, but since you're on, Jacob, go right ahead and ask your question.
Oh, I see it. Thank you for telling me that for future reference. Yeah, I'm just curious whether there's any qualitative research looking at why tobacco and marijuana in smoked form are used together. Anecdotally, I know this is just an anecdote, but I've been around marijuana users a lot, and 100% of the time, they use tobacco with marijuana because marijuana burns very fast and tobacco burns slower, and they don't want all of their relatively more expensive marijuana to burn while they're waiting between puffs. So I'm just curious if there's any research to support that.
So qualitative work, there is qualitative work that's done, looking at co-use. Again, this takes a couple of different forms in terms of the endpoints investigators were really interested in, and the way that they were structuring, you know, interview guides and things along those lines. It's really mostly focused, the qualitative research that I've seen is really mostly focused on reasons and effects of co-use, not so much what's going on with products, which I think you tap into a really important issue there. You know, is there something, are there product characteristics or something about the use of particular forms of nicotine or cannabis, using them together, blunts is a great example, that contribute and facilitate, you know, kind of these promoted co-use practices. So, you know, I think you're touching on something really important when thinking about, you know, what's going on from a product standpoint rather than, you know, a drug effect standpoint. I think, again, this kind of points toward this need for including information more about product characteristics in our assessments of co-use rather than focusing as much on some of the psychological and behavioral endpoints of interest. We have more work that's been done in that area and kind of less on the former. But there are qualitative papers out there. Many of them aren't recent. I'm happy to share some references though, if you're interested.
No, yeah, thank you. We have a paper under review at the Cleveland Clinic Center for Value-Based Care Research, looking at the population health effects of various policies on co-use of marijuana and tobacco. So this is very helpful. Thanks.
Wonderful.
Danielle, we have a question in the chat from Karen. And Karen, I'm going to ask if do you want to come off of mute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks, Erica. So I really enjoyed the presentation, Dr. Smith, and I think you're hitting on a lot of really important methodological issues here, one of which I sort of was thinking about as you were introducing the co-use data, and that is, how do you decide, or how has it been decided, whether someone is primarily a nicotine user who occasionally uses cannabis versus, you know, the flip side of the equation? What are some of the ways that it's been done, and how did you guys do it in the past study with those data?
Yeah, so this comes down, it's a bit of a mixed bag based on the papers that I've seen. A lot of what's been done in this area boils down to either relying on inclusion criteria for particular studies, and from the epi perspective, since I work mostly in the epi domain, depends on how good your measures are, right? So if we're looking at, in the PATH data in particular, we have a lot of really good data on tobacco use and nicotine product use and patterns of use, frequency of use, all of that. In the earlier waves, not so much on cannabis. Really the most granular that you can get for the general population is past 30-day cannabis use in the PATH data. If you're going any more restrictive than that with the PATH data, you're really looking at a substance use problem population. So for the PATH data, we're really just kind of keeping it simple based on the measures that we have available at our disposal, looking at past 30-day use of both products. Some of the work we've done with more recent data in ITC, we do have more granular measurements to work with ITC because we just came up with the questions to do it. So, you know, we've segmented co-use, for instance, looking at daily consumers of cigarettes, and then segmenting them out based on whether they have frequent, being daily or near daily, or infrequent use of cannabis over the past 30 days. So there's been different ways that people have kind of defined and approached looking at these populations and looking at their corresponding endpoints. I think some more harmonization or some more standards, or just even research looking into differences and how that's operationalized could really be beneficial to help point the field in a more concrete direction. But really a lot of it comes down to, you know, the measures that you have available to work with.
Would anyone else? Oh, Stephanie.
Thank you. Okay, so you've done a really fantastic job describing what sounds like a very complex set of behaviors. And I know you brushed upon this a little bit, but I'm really interested in these hemp-derived cannabinoids that you mentioned and touched on earlier in your presentation. And I wanted to get a sense of if you have a sense of how or what the prevalence looks like in the populations that you've studied. Are people using these products? And I sort of asked this knowing that these products have really exploded more recently following the 2018 Farm Bill. So do you have any sense of what that use pattern looks like and how that might interplay here?
Stephanie, you ask a wonderful question. The answer is no. The answer is no. I think those data are direly needed. I've seen a lot of, very few broad strokes papers at the population level, just kind of looking at use of Delta 8, for example. What's the prevalence of Delta 8? How prevalent is it among cannabis consumers? But in the lens of co-use, this is not something that's been looked at, and I think it's extremely important, particularly based on what we do know so far about Delta 8 use. People talk about it, consumers talk about it as, the diet cannabis or cannabis light, and pharmacologically, it seems to be the case that it's about twice as much Delta 8 that's required to achieve a similar single dose of Delta 9 THC. So, I think there's really interesting questions to address there. I think looking at it through the lens of nicotine and cannabis use is going to be important. We know, again, many cannabis consumers are concentrated in the nicotine consumer population. So those data are very much needed. Would be a great paper to publish.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Maybe we'll talk later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have to.
One of the conversations that Stephanie and I have had about that product particularly is because it is co-located in these retail stores right next to the tobacco.
Yeah.
Right. So it would seem like it is, the targeting is when you think about facilitators, it's right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk more. Are there other questions from the audience? Okay. Well, hearing none, I will just take the opportunity to ask everyone if maybe you could come on video and just give Dr. Smith a round of applause for joining us today and say thank you. And Danielle, it's always wonderful to hear you and listen to you. And it was so nice to have all of this body of work so clearly presented. I think you've really given everyone a much deeper understanding of the intersection between cannabis and nicotine co-use and sort of the things we need to understand and why we need to understand them before we can really make a judgment call on the impacts on public health. So thank you so much for your presentation today. I'll remind everyone that we will be posting this recorded video onto our YouTube channel. And so if you have colleagues who are not here today, but you'd like to share this with them, please do. And we also invite everyone to join us next month when we'll have another tobacco-related presentation from Dr. Liz Klein from Ohio State University. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.